and accomplished so much when he had ALS that it makes me look like a slacker, like most of us. But he was really fantastic. Tonight we're going to talk about somebody who I just subconsciously, it came that I should talk about, Hannah Arendt. And a name that some of you do know, some of you don't know. But the bottom line is she is one of the most, if you will, remarkable intellectuals that we've had in the 20th century. And more importantly is that she's often not seen as a Jewish thinker or a Jewish philosopher. But I think we have to just understand when we talk about Jewish philosophy, what is Jewish philosophy? Is there such a thing? Is there just philosophy? What makes it Jewish? Well, all philosophy has to deal with the issues of existence and why we exist, et cetera, in different ways, and people have answered it in different ways from ancient times, and they will continue to do so in the future. But ultimately, a Jewish philosopher is trying to solve, if you will, a bit of a conundrum. And the conundrum is ultimately, why be Jewish? When situations around you are changing, what is it that is to be held on to? This is what I think that's so important in what we understand. What is it we want to hold on to, and how do we stay a Jew in the modern world? And the people I've talked about, Rosenzweig and others, Rosenzweig becoming an existentialist, pretty much talking about the fact that everything is basically for Rosenzweig as going from the individual complexity, if you will, into life, as he ends his book, The Star of Redemption. Just a little bit about Hannah Arendt, if you don't know who she was, but many of you do. She was born in 1906, October, and she died in December of 1975. And she's known for many, many things, and I could do some biographical stuff, but you can find all that stuff pretty much online. But just to know one thing, that she really, in all of those years, starting in the 20s all the way through the end of her life, was a very active public intellectual. A public intellectual is someone who not only writes books, but basically engages in what we would hopefully be fruitful polemic, machloket l'shem shemayim, arguments for the sake of the divine. But the bottom line of Hannah Arendt is that she really is really important for our own times, because her greatest contribution was this book called The Origins of Totalitarianism. And many of you, I'm sure, have heard of the book, maybe were assigned that book a long time ago. It's a book that took a decade or two for it to develop. That, of course, it deals a lot with her own experiences being a German Jew. There's a tremendous growth of interest in Hannah Arendt because of our own fears in her own day of the rise of totalitarianism around the world. And it's kind of interesting, this book was written in 1951, at least it appeared in 1951, not a very long time ago. But yet a lot of her analysis really is totally up to date, and that, which is frightening in a way. I wish it wasn't as up to date, but it seems to be a lot of the stuff that she describes and how totalitarian emerges, we see before our eyes today. Her book has 3 sections to it, but most importantly, she begins with something that was the closest to her as an individual, as a person, and that was anti-Semitism. Already in the 1930s and the 40s, she began to write very long essays. By the way, if any of you do want it, just let me know, and I can give you a URL to a PDF of a wonderful book that was put out called The Jewish Writings. Someone collected all the Jewish writings of Arendt. I mean, buy the book if you want so that you get royalties, but if you want to print out the 386 pages a day, enjoy it. But it's a great book to read because it really gives a certain coherence to her life and how ultimately her Jewishness really was always a thread that really took her life along. She became notoriously well known, besides this book, which was not a notorious kind of thing, but for a number of essays she wrote for the New Yorker in the 1960s, in the early 60s, as she went to Jerusalem to be a reporter about the Eichmann trial. She returns from that assignment. Her essays, those are the days when the New Yorker had long essays, right? That's 86 pages a week. Remember those days? It was about a very long essays. Put it together, and the book was called The Banality of Evil, and it became a controversial book. This is 1963. The trial was 1963. So she comes back and she enters into this tremendously large controversy, which ultimately reflects on everything else in her biography, everything else in her life, ultimately comes into this place where the banality of evil becomes sort of a phrase, which she took from someone else, but a phrase that raises hackles on the one hand, and also for others, an explanation of evil. She wrote a book called The Human Condition following that, and we'll talk a bit about that as well if you have time. So it's impossible in this very short time we have to obviously do everything about Arendt. But what we should know is basically she was a reflection of her time. And we, last week, Rosenzweig, a Central European and German Jew as well. Hannah Arendt, a Central European German Jew. And her remarkable success was in her capacity to give herself the best possible resources intellectually she could find. She was lucky, of course. She was raised in a fairly middle class and upper middle class family of merchants. They were social democrats, very little religion, if you will. Don't know if they were anti-religious, but that was not in any way how they defined themselves. But she was able to rise up to university, to do a doctorate in Heidelberg on St. Augustine's Confessions, with I think under the tutelage of a well-known philosopher, Karl Jaspers. Whatever, she also had an affair with Martin Heidegger. Imagine that. When she was a student in Marburg, he was in marriage, don't tell anybody, but it's okay. And she got romantically involved. Now, I have a little bit of a theory in my own head. This is me. I haven't read this anywhere yet, but you can quote me if you will. I have a feeling that her relationship with Heidegger, which was controversial because Heidegger became a Nazi. Not that he became a guard at a concentration camp, but he bought into it. He decided he was going to join, right after their relationship. And it was very short-lived. I think that because of this is just coming out of my head, is that because of her relationship with Heidegger, who she was romantically involved with, she liked older philosophers, people that she studied with. And so she thought, well, how could I have fallen in love with a monster? He was just a person. So when she describes in her book, Eichmann in Jerusalem, that Eichmann was not a monster, that he was just merely a cog in the machine, that maybe she intimates in some ways that he may not even be anti-Semitic, but he bought into a system. And that's what she talks about in her books, The Origins of Totalitarianism, how these systems are created and how they really envelop everything. So it became a real controversy. How could you say he was not a monster? How could you say he was not an anti-Semite? How could you take, in a sense, anti-Semitism out of the equation? Is this something else that's going on? It's just basically, and ultimately the question will become, why the Jews? And she explains how the Jews really became an effective, quote unquote, scapegoat in order to fulfill the other, if you will, intentions of the Third Reich, which was, of course, creating this 1,000-year empire. So I think that may be something that she didn't want to see, that Heidegger was somehow, so out of the ordinary as a German. So maybe that's why she could also see that. That's totally made up, but that's making up as I go along. So what is Hannah Arendt's basic thesis? Well, the thesis is that civil action is the only thing that ultimately can in some way suppress the tendency towards totalitarianism. She makes a big deal about action. Now, you might say that's very banal, right? We've heard about that already. Of course we've heard about it. But she, as a systematic thinker, tries to basically make that and posit that as the ultimate thing of not having the via passiva, if you will, but having, or the via contemplativa, but it should be the active life in society. She also dealt with two terms that came up in her book, which were rattling around for a long time in her mind. And one was the tendency and the conflict or the interchange with the pariah and the parvenu, the Jew as a pariah or parvenu. Very interesting. You know what a parvenu is? It's someone who tries to rise up into higher society, if you will, assimilate him or herself into the what was going on at the time and try to become like the host society. That's the parvenu. And it has a negative kind of impact now, of course, after certainly after Arendt's analysis of it. And then there's the pariah, and the pariah is the outsider. Pariah is the outsider. We would see the word pariah as a very negative term today. What is interesting is these terms, parvenu and pariah, which is her way of trying to understand how to be a Jew, how can one be a Jew in this world, in this modern world, is ultimately that the pariah is the one that cares about his or her own self-preservation and his or her own identity. And ultimately, it is the pariah that is the more authentic than the parvenu. And but they're in the same boat. It doesn't really matter, because the person who will eventually lash out in anti-Semitism is not really that much of a, he'll probably get the parvenu first, and then he'll get to the pariah. But the truth has come home that there is no protection, she says, there's no protection in heaven or earth against bare murder. And a man can be driven at any moment from the streets and broad places once open to all. At long last, it has become clear that the senseless freedom of the individual merely paves the way for the senseless suffering of his entire people. So it's a very big accusation. She felt that all of the, perhaps in her own circles as well, all of the attempt to assimilate, to become part of, ultimately was a trigger to a kind of a fear. That was a fear that was engendered, of course, by Nazi ideology, a fear that there's been infiltration. The terms that you hear all the time today, right? Infiltration. And our culture is being somehow becoming degenerate, whatever term you want to use. All of those words were used, degeneracy, etc. So her idea was basically that both the parvenu and the pariah eventually are in the same boat. But somehow the parvenu has undermined his or her own authenticity. So ironically, the result of barbarous actions of the slaughter of the Jews, the barbarous actions, ultimately the parvenu keeps on saying, why me? And the pariah sort of knows why it's him or her. The pariah knows who he or she is. And my job of the pariah, the Jew, is to say I'm a Jew. I am a Jew in this society. And if you want to have a real society, it must be a society that includes me to be who I want to be. Right? That's the threat we're all feeling today, right? We want to have the right for America to truly be what it's supposed to be. Right? Which is that basically I can be who I want to be. So it goes back to the individual from an existential point of view, but for Arendt, it stretches from the individual to the idea of community. Community that can do this. The individual can't do this. And because of this, in her early years, in the 20s and 30s, she was very attracted to Zionism and was very influenced by Buber and others who had become Zionists. And she has an on and off relationship with Zionism, but through her entire life, somehow, she's concerned about these matters, even though she becomes very, very critical of Israel, and etc. But the bottom line is that she never loses that attachment to this idea that there's going to be a place. But the fear is the place where they will settle in, they will stop being pariahs. To have a state of your own, you stop being a pariah to that state. So it's very ironic in a way, right? If you have your own homeland and you have your own control. She was, by the way, politically, I would say, in the same places where Buber and Magnus and others who believed in a binational state. It was called the Ichud movement. It started in about the late 40s as trying to say that we shouldn't have our own independent state. It should be a binational state. The idea didn't take off very well. Now we're hearing again people saying it's the end of the two states. It should be one state. Narishkeit, but that's okay. We won't talk about that now. But her idea of her support for Zionism was because it did create a new kind of way of being a Jew. Even Freud, who in many ways tried as much as possible to always be defensive about his Jewish identity. And some years later, Diane, so somebody who somehow was so, it was so complex, it was so weird, it was so, on the one hand, he understood the centrality of it in his own life, and the other hand, he tried to diminish it in any way he can. But when it came to Zionism, he didn't make Aliyah. He could have, like other German Jews, gone to Palestine. He doesn't do that. But he does understand deeply that what Zionism has done is created a greater sense of peoplehood. He has a very famous letter to the B'nai B'rith, Freud, when he's invited. And he writes, I have to say, ultimately, I admire what you're doing because you are keeping Jewish peoplehood together, rather than any kind of religious kind of articulation of it. That probably was one of Zionism's greatest successes, and was to be able to overcome the idea of a religious identity for many. Just a few more things just about her. She begins her book with analysis of anti-Semitism. You'll probably go back to the book now, I hope. It's a large book. It's not an easy read, by the way. She's not easy. She writes English and German and English, very long sentences. But you get to them. They're very good. She writes very, very well. But it begins she focuses first, the major focus for her in this book is the Dreyfus Affair. Those who are aware of the Dreyfus Affair, it was in the 1890s. And it basically split France apart and most of Europe apart between those who were pro-Dreyfus and those we call the anti-Dreyfusards against Dreyfus. But more importantly, what it was, it asked that central question that I just asked at the beginning: what is it to be a Jew in France? That was the question. And here was an assimilated parvenu, Dreyfus, right? Captain of the French armed forces, etc. And of course, through, the story, I don't have to go into it, he's basically framed as a spy and convicted and in a very public way, humiliated, and created a tremendous fervor of, if you will, of the latent anti-Semitism about Jews being traitors to our country, Jews not being able ever to be French, can't be French, they can never make it into Frenchdom, because nationalism of France would not permit it. That happens today as well, when you have, the chances of seeing the Muslim community integrate in France are much tougher than perhaps anywhere else right now. Very tough. You don't break into French. The Dreyfus Affair goes on. Very famous writers write about it, and ultimately it is revealed that he was framed. Och and vey, what could the anti-Semites do? So they go back under the rocks for a while. But they're there. The main thing was it split open, this divide, and she starts with that. And she traces all of these social movements that arose as a way of dealing with some of the problems that were created in the Dreyfus Affair. So she observed that modern anti-Semitism grew in proportion as traditional nationalism declined and reached its climax at the exact moment when the European system of nation states and its precarious balance of power crashed. And when did that happen? That happened with World War I and the aftermath. This idea of empire was shattered. Ottoman Empire defeated. Russian Empire defeated. Tremendous lack of the nation state in that sense, or able to maintain itself. And certainly that's what happened in Germany from itself, that there was no possible nation, civic state ever to really be established in a strong enough way, which left the door open, of course. So Nazi Germany, he says, would later exploit this anti-Semitism and targeted the Jewry, which was construed, among other things, as a proxy for the nation state. In doing so, Nazism sought, among other reasons, to organize the masses to bring about the disintegration of the nation-state system and to advance the totalitarian project, which was global in its orientation. So this is a very interesting way to look at these things, right? The Jew became, it's like I'm making no comparisons with Nazism and Trumpism, please, okay? Just make it very clear. Right? But when When you hear someone talk about the deep state, who are you talking about? Right? The boogeyman. Shut up. There isn't anything that we can do here. It's all clandestine. It's all underneath. There's always a festering, if you will, swamp of evil that is there, that has to be kept down, in order for us to do the best that we can according to whatever idea we have. So the blast of the destruction of the nation state, which the Jew had such issues in getting into. You remember the famous declaration at the in the French Parliament after Napoleon's reign came up if a Jew would like to be a Frenchman, that's fine, but the bottom line is he can no longer be part of the Jewish people. So there's no more authority in Jewish communal life. That was the real demand. That was the demand of the modern civic state. You had to give up. And people were so happy in giving that up. You have no idea. Between the 1789 revolution and 1814, 15, hundreds of thousands of Jews looked at it as a reason to take away their traditional observances. We're looking for a way to get out of the ghetto into this new cosmopolitan, if you will, environment that exists. She then in the book discusses scientific racism and its role in colonialist imperialism, which also, if you think about it, is not in any way attempting to avoid globalization. It's globalization. Instead, Nazism was a form of globalization. We're going to make the whole world this, right? Hellenism, right? Was a kind of the whole world will become this. And the same thing happens when if you have colonialist imperialism, the whole world will become like we are. We will impose upon the world the values that we think are the true values. That's what imperialism is, and that's what colonialism is to a certain degree. So that unlimited expansion necessarily opposed itself and was hostile to the territorial delimited nation state. And Arendt traces the roots of modern imperialism to the accumulation of excess capital in European nation states during the 19th century. And this capital required overseas investments outside of Europe to be productive, and political control had to be expanded overseas to protect investments. Sounds like it's happening today, all of this stuff. So she then examines continental imperialism, pan-Germanism, pan-Slavism, and the emergence of movements substituting themselves to the political parties. And these movements are hostile to the state, and the term that's used, they were anti-parliamentarist, or we would say today anti-Congress, and gradually institutionalized anti-Semitism and other kinds of racism. Arendt concludes this section of the book that while Italian fascism was a nationalist authoritarian movement, Nazism and Stalinism were totalitarian movements that sought to eliminate all restraints upon the power of the movement. You might say it's a small difference, but it really isn't. In a sense, when you were a Nazi, according to Arendt, you were not a German nationalist. That was over. Germany was done for. Whether we had a hand in doing that, the Allies, yes, I think we had a hand in doing it. We helped create an environment for this. There's no question about it. But the idea of this internationalism, globalism, had to do, of course, and still is very much part of what we as in our part of the world see as the economic structures, the world economic structures that we are dependent on, no longer independent from. We are dependent on. This is ironic with what's going on now with China, right? And we're both dependent on each other, and we still don't know how to really figure it out. Because there's always that sense, it's like you're in a wrestling match, and you never know who's going to be at top at any given moment. So this is going to be this constant struggle. This is going to go on for a while, by the way, this constant struggle. Now she talks about the mechanics of totalitarian movements. I'm doing this with a little bit of detail because I want to make sure I get what she says out to you correctly. So in the final section of the book, on totalitarianism, she basically said there were certain mechanics. Mechanics. And that's a very good word she uses, because we're talking about the building of a machine. It's the building of a machine. Excuse me. And when you have a machine and make it run properly, and the machine is already programmed to do what it has to do, then there basically all you have to do is bring it in for tune-ups at your mechanic. And there are certain mechanics like, that have been involved in this over the last 120 years. So she describes, it focuses obviously on the two major totalitarian systems that she knew at that time, which were Nazism and Stalinism. She didn't know anything about Chinese communism, it hadn't become as strong a force until after the war. And she discusses the basic role of, this is something we should all pay attention to, we all do, propaganda. Propaganda. Both the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, she does in great detail, understood the role of propaganda. And we now see propaganda as a negative thing in its own word itself. It just means letting people know. And she goes very much into dealing with this. I won't go into all the details. I'll give you a little bit of it. Then it's also that this propaganda was not meant necessarily for the people within the country. This is something that we see all the time. It's what was meant for to push out and pull and push and be able to convince or somehow make it more palatable to the outside, non-totalitarian world. So what they broadcast out was the big lie, which we know what that means. And you say it long enough, guess what? It becomes sort of impermeable. So the next thing is that this government that's created, whether it's the Soviet or the Nazi, it depends on this propaganda. So propaganda and governing become synonymous. And there's also something that goes on, which we, of course, have been talking about for a number of years now, but it's why it's so interesting to see Arendt's approach to it, is taking the idea of classes, which have always existed in society, and changing it into masses. Masses. Explain that. Right now we say this is no longer that I'm appealing to a certain class, I'm asserting to a mass. I know that doesn't sound too different, but it is different because you are no longer, basically the issue for a lower class person was, how do I make it up to the next level? How do I make it up to the next level? I make it to the next level. So it becomes a very different kind of structure, but you have masses that you now are part of something far larger than even your class. There's no longer a chipping order that I have to get up to be the top Nazi. It didn't matter. That's not why you became a non-Nazi. You became a Nazi because everybody else was a Nazi. Because the masses are spoken. The elites became silent. Or the elites worse than that. If you think about it, I know some of you may have read this material, but the point is that Arendt often says about the fact that you have the combination of the new technologies, particularly in the 1920s and 30s. The two major ones were radio, amazing, and airplanes. For example, Hitler is imprisoned in 1924 after attempting a putsch, a takeover in Munich. At that time, the Weimar Republic, as you know, was quite weak. His newly formed National Socialist Party, etc., was trying to make a name for itself, and they picked November 8th, of course. Everything is November 8th, November 9th, because it's always trying to commemorate the terrible, terrible degradation of the German people at Versailles, at the signing of the Versailles Treaty. Kristallnacht on 8th and 9th, and that's why you have the wall on the 8th and 9th. It's all very symbolic. So he has this putsch, he's arrested. At that time, he was seen as obviously somebody far, far beyond the margins of German society, and he's imprisoned, And while he's in prison, he writes this book, Mein Kampf. Big book, obviously. It's pretty explicit in what it's saying, except most people never read it, but it became a bestseller while he was still in prison. It was the kind of book you never read, but everybody had to have it on their shelf. I've tried to read it myself. I don't know, it doesn't do it for me. He also, when he leaves prison, says, I think I've got something going here. I've got popularity. People know my name. Let's use that the best way possible. So he begins literally taking advantage of the greatest technology he could find, going with airplane, believe it or not, airplane for short little stops in different cities, having the advanced crew there. He knows all the business with the spinmeisters, the advanced crew, setting up the crowd, setting up the screens for the films they want to show. He uses every possible modern technique that he could. This is very important. These are not savage, if you will, people who are drawing on the, grading chalk on a blackboard. These are people who will really have it down to a science. And the elites at this point, already probably starting, I would say, the elites in Germany are still very wary about this rise. They're afraid of totalitarianism. They are ready, however, as Arendt points out, they're hooked into this economic thing that I was talking about. So on the one hand, the elites think about business, and think about business being as good as it possibly be. So talk of expansionism and talk of this and that, it doesn't disturb them as much as it should. Second, the Jews of Germany, the elite Jews of Germany, had for close to 100 years been relating only to a small group of elite Germans who were people in the traditions of Goethe, quote unquote liberals, if you want to put quotation marks around it, but people who saw themselves as, the German term was gebildet, cultivated, uplifted. And they spoke to each other and they never really heard anything going on below them. And there was no capacity on the part of this elite to even conceive of the classes becoming the masses and then losing their own voices, because their voices get thundered out by the footsteps and the knee-jerk reactions. So totalitarian movements are fundamentally different from autocratic regimes. Arendt says, insofar as autocratic regimes seek only to gain absolute political power and to outlaw opposition, while totalitarian regimes seek to dominate every aspect of everyone's life as a prelude to world domination. A quote from her, she says, intellectual, spiritual, and artistic initiative is as dangerous to totalitarianism as the gangster initiative of the mob. And both are more dangerous than mere political opposition. The persistent persecution of every higher form of intellectual activity by the new mass leaders springs from more than their natural resentment against everything they cannot understand. Total domination does not allow for free initiative in any field of life, for any activity that is not entirely predictable. Totalitarianism in power invariably replaces all first-rate talents, regardless of their sympathies with those crackpots and fools whose lack of intelligence and creativity is still the best guarantee of their loyalty. This was not a New York Times editorial last week, by the way. It seems like I read this last week, but this is really quite an amazing description of what a totalitarian regime does. And then she uses, of course, the text. She's a very, very detailed writer, talks all about the front organizations that are put up and fake governmental agencies and esoteric doctrines and conspiracy theories, and trying whenever possible to conceal the totalitarian aims from the non-totalitarian world. The final section of the book, which was added in the second edition in 1958, she suggests that, and this is something that I don't know if it's somehow talking about herself or not, but she says that individual isolation and loneliness are preconditions for totalitarian domination. Let me say it again, okay? Individual isolation and loneliness are preconditions for totalitarian domination. So, as I say, it is impossible in the short time that I have to go through everything that Hannah Arendt wrote, but I would just let you know that she had a broad range of topics: nature of power, of evil, ideas of democracy, authority, and as I said, she got involved in the current day, if you will, politics of the day. She has left a great legacy. Some have said it's even a cult, like the Ayn Rand people who have a cult of Ayn Rand. But she did shun publicity. She never really saw herself as a cover girl, if you will. She was a serious woman, smoked a lot, really a lot. I mean, surprised she lived to be as old as she did. She really smoked a lot. And there's now a school of philosophical theory called the Arendtian School. And she established the Library Trust, which eventually wound up at Bard College, where she was for a number of years before she died. And Bard College has set up a Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. She also taught at the New School, where many German refugees taught. By the way, in her years in New York, she wrote for the Aufbau, the German Jewish newspaper. She had a column there, etc. She never detached herself, even though people, after the Banality of Evil book, kept to see her as she must be, hates Jews, hates Israel, because there was some incrimination there that somehow the Jews, particularly the councils of Jews in the various ghettos, were sort of, if you will, collaborators with the Nazi regime. It gets very, I sent you some stuff to read about the controversy if you get a chance to take a look at that. A journal has been created by that as well. And there's a documentary that was done, and it talks about what I mentioned, and it's called basically Vita Activa, The Spirit of Hannah Arendt. It was done in 2015. It seems to be, there was another film done, a feature film in 2017, a fictionalized version, and I believe it was a more avant-garde film in 2018. So here we have, he died in 1975, now it's a number of years after that, 50 years after, and there is sort of a revival, particularly because of the conditions that we are facing today, a tremendous amount of new attention being brought to the basics of how totalitarian regimes come to be, and how ultimately, and that's why I was so taken by what you wrote in that new preface in 58 about how social isolation, how loneliness, that these movements come to answer something, This is what we have to do. If we're really, and again, this is off the topic a little bit, but if we're really going to be critically active in making this election in November work in that way, you've got to really address some of those basic existential stuff. And Corona has not helped us at all when it comes to social isolation. So we don't know how this is going to turn out. But remember, these are the real questions. Questions for politics. It's not the questions only of who's going to be sitting in whatever seat. The question of politics is what part of the psyche of this country is represented. What answers can be given, if at all, to what people's great needs are. We speak a lot about fear. Yes, that's there for sure. A lot of fear. Jews will not replace us. Well, I wouldn't replace them because I got a better job replacing somebody else. So I'm not going to replace that. But this is really the kernel of what of this renewed interest, is that we understand very much that one thing modernity has created is an atomization of society. That's why for her, the pariah Jew, at least the pariah Jew, was to find himself or herself in a minyan, was to be in a Jewish community. Now, he doesn't want to just become part of German society. And that's why even that pariah ultimately is the core that will be always a stick in the eye of the emperor. Always saying, in a way, the emperor's wearing no clothes. And that's why Jews have been seen as pariahs. But you know what? You can take that into a, if you will, positive definition. I've heard much too much, which is often what I do. But Just a few things that have come up. There was a book written a while back. It was a wonderful book reviewer for the New York Times, Kakutani, if you know her work, Miko Kakutani. And she wrote a book, and basically it's sort of a book that's really an homage to Hannah Arendt. And she observes and says, on the critical role the propaganda plays in gaslighting, if you will, populations. She observes, in an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached a point where they would at the same time believe everything and nothing. Think that everything was possible and that nothing was true. The totalitarian mass leaders based their propaganda on the correct psychological assumption that under such conditions, one could make people believe the most fantastic statements one day and trust that if the next day they were given irrefutable proof of their falsehood, they would take refuge in cynicism. Instead of deserting their leaders who had lied to them, they would protest that they had known all along that the statement was a lie and would admire the leaders for their superior tactical cleverness. Pretty amazing, huh? It's happening right in front of our eyes. So I'm going to stop for a minute because I'm thirsty and I talk too much. And if you want to just wave your hand, you want to say something, unmute yourself. We'll have Barbara. Go ahead. Unmute yourself, Barbara. Okay.
My son's writing a screenplay on her and Walter Benjamin, their relationship.
Yes, they became close friends, Walter Benjamin.
Yeah. Can you speak a little about that?
I don't know enough about their relationship. I do know that she got very much involved with refugees and getting people out of Europe as much as she could. She worked pretty hard at that. As part of the Zionist movement, she worked for many of these organizations, etc. But they had met, I believe in Berlin, I'm not sure, but they had met. She also was incarcerated, by the way, Hannah Arendt, for a while in one of the early concentration camps, Gurs, it was in France. But she and Benjamin became friends. And interesting, one of Benjamin's most closest friends was a great Jewish scholar named Gershon Scholem. A very interesting book about Walter. Walter Benjamin, if you know, or Walter Benjamin, as he's called in German, it was a great, I would call him an aesthete. He was a great literary critic. He was a great art critic, etc. A man of tremendous thought and words. Eventually, he kills himself when he's caught. It was about to be taken from the ghetto in Poland. And Gershon Scholem, who was very close friends, and obviously also knew Arendt very well in many ways. He was her major attacker after the Eichmann book. Gershon Scholem. For Gershon Scholem to really come out after you, he had a real coterie of people who joined. And she was taken aback because if there's anybody who understood her world, it was probably Gershon Scholem, who came from very similar kind of world. Anyone else? Any questions, comments? Yes, Joel. We'll do Joel, then we'll do Ken. Joel, unmute.
Yes. You said that a totalitarian leader uses propaganda to convince the rest of the world, the outside world.
It's not totalitarian, right.
That's right. But I don't understand that. It seems to me that, from what I would know, that Hitler was trying to mold the German people into what he wanted. It seemed like it was internal as much as anything. He certainly wasn't convincing.
Sure did. He convinced someone called Neville. He convinced someone called Neville Chamberlain.
Yes.
He convinced him in 1938.
You're saying
sign a non-aggression pact because I'm a man of peace. I come to you in peace, Hitler said. I'm not interested in expansionism. I need Czechoslovakia for, so I guess, personal reasons. But, what's it to you if you give me Sudetenland?
Wasn't Neville Chamberlain also trying to win peace in our time for his own just basically to.
Of course, I mean, I agree. I mean, what is it? The bottom line is that the propaganda was so strong and possible that you could see somehow how Hitler could portray himself as a savior of the German people, as a peace-loving savior of the Jewish people, the German people, who have been so degraded, so destroyed because of what happened after the First World War. And within Germany, it was more extreme than that. I'm not saying there wasn't propaganda going on inside too. It was more extreme.
Okay.
Because you took over the schools, you fired people, you created laws of racial laws. It's much more. But that's not already an issue of propaganda. He's already got the masses behind him, and be able to carry out this stuff. He doesn't have to worry about opposition because, he comes into power in 1933. I won't go into the whole history of it. And then there's the Reichstag fire 6 months later. Oh, they want to burn down the country. Let me arrest everybody. Okay, sure, great. You're doing the best thing we could do. They wanted to destroy the Reichstag. Arrest everybody. So he was able to get that done. Ken.
A follow-up to Joel's question. So it seemed to me that, from what I know of Nazism, that was really a nationalist movement based on, Deutschland über alles, but still with Deutschland as the center, not so much world domination. I mean, even, he was trying to take over big parts of Europe, but it still seemed to me that it was based more in a nationalist perspective. But kind of bringing it up to the present, kind of the irony.
Before that, Hannah Arendt disagrees with you. Okay.
Well, I know.
Hannah Arendt, I think Philip Roth also, in the Plot Against America, also disagrees with you that if there was a way to get to the United States, they would have found a way. Believe me.
Okay. Well, I'm thinking now of our modern totalitarian leaders, and if you call our president a totalitarian.
No, I wouldn't give him that credit yet. No.
Well, okay.
He has to work a little harder.
He's certainly on the way, but all the other ones, the Hungarian president, the Brazilian president, they're not looking for world domination. They're just trying to make their own countries. It's a very nationalist movement. That's what the Trumpism is, a nationalist movement. He could care less about, whether we. That's
what I'm saying. I don't think we're on the road to totalitarianism. I think we're on the road to what I call it, oligarchism, anarchy, and not autocracy, however you want to call it. I'm agreeing. I'm not saying we're on the road to totalitarianism. I don't think that's what he's aiming for. He would love it if everybody did what he wanted to do.
I guess it depends on how you define totalitarianism. If you define it as a system for controlling a populace, whether it's because you want world domination or you just want to control your own country, a lot of these modern autocrats
autocrat's a good word.
I mean, they all have systems of spying on, look at the Chinese. They all have systems of spying on their people.
Yes, of course.
There's not a lot of autonomy. So
but I'm saying that what Hitler did in Germany, at least the difference between what makes it totalitarian, is that he wanted to restructure all of society, all of it, because he believed that restructuring society will be a model. Now, Chinese communism believes that.
Right.
It believes that what it has is the best possible system in the world, one guy on top, and you want to get things done, get it done in China, right? You want to buy up Africa, you don't have to ask the Senate to buy up Africa. You control resources. Now, did Mao have a sense of world domination? Absolutely. Did Stalin? Yeah, absolutely. Did Hitler? Absolutely. And you're naming now 3 totalitarian regimes. Now, I don't want to get into Iran or what if Iran has issues of wanting to dominate that area, for sure. There's no question. And they too operate on a totalitarian model where every part of your life is controlled. How you dress, how you speak, where you go to buy clothes, etc. So that's the idea of totalitarianism. And in Germany, it was set up as there would be a Nazi church eventually. Without a Bible on the lectern, but Mein Kampf. And there would be statues of Hitler in the churches. There was a wonderful book by Susanna Heschel of how the German Protestant churches wanted to de-Judaize the Bible. You couldn't say Jesus was Jewish; that would be an affront. So it meant recalibrating everybody's basic patterns of what they believe to something greater. Anyone else? comments, questions? Yes, Diane.
This isn't what I wanted to talk about, but
So then
economic.
don't. So then don't.
No, because I also wanted to make the point, as other people are making. But you can tease me because I'll tease you.
That's all right.
No, that's fine. We have a good time. I just wanted to say that the economic systems are different today, where you have a global economic system. So the United States, I disagree that the United States doesn't give a damn about the other countries. The United States is in there trying to dominate like every other country. And the nationalist ideology that Trump has is different than the liberal Democrats have. But nobody is saying that the United States shouldn't be the strongest, wealthiest country in the world. So I don't want to see everybody else as evil and we're good, because we're in the ball game. You know, basically.
Definitely in the ball game. Definitely in the ball game.
So that was the point. But the question I wanted us to, thank you. The thing I wanted to go by that was always the most interesting to me was the Eichmann trial and the debate that she had in Israel. And if we could move to that discussion, I would appreciate it. I don't want to block off any other, but that's.
I put onto the announcement for tonight's class something for you to look at, which is a sort of a whole discussion of the controversy. I'll deal with it, if you will, in brief now. But there's a lot to read. I mean, I can send you. You'll have material for the next year about it, because it was such a big controversy, and it brought in so many different sides. So the controversy was basically that she saw at the Eichmann trial, she saw a man in a glass booth. It's the name of a play about Eichmann's trial. A man in a glass booth. A rather average-looking man with an average build, an average suit, and an average haircut. And that's what she saw there. And he was being accused, right, of mass murder. I mean, she doesn't give enough attention to the fact that the real reason for the Eichmann trial had nothing to do with Eichmann, but was to tell the world the story, which already had been forgotten, less than 16 years after the war. Right. And that was the real reason for the trial, was that to have historians come and say, this is what happened. And it opened up our eyes, too, in the United States, to finally be able to talk about the we haven't stopped talking about it since, because there's a lot to say. So she looks at this fellow, and she looks at his career, and she looks at it and her knowledge of what creates these kinds of people. And she says, this person was basically created by a system. He had no sense of his own choice, in a way, which everybody found fairly reprehensible, that people always have choices. Right? They're not automatons. If they're automatons, you can't hold anybody guilty for anything, right? So she's basically, that was one of her statements. It's much more complicated than that. I mean, she also says, not everything it was but using that term, banality of evil. That evil is, look, it's just an average guy, and it somehow smelled that she was trying to sort of. I don't want to use the term excuse it, but trying to overcome the idea that he was, quote unquote, the guilty one, the mastermind. Even though I think that's totally wrong, but that was what she put out. Then she put out a second thing as part of it, as I mentioned, about the possible collaboration of the elders of the Jewish councils in the big ghettos. If Freddie is aware of them, these councils of elders were forced to be on these councils. There were councils there already. There were Jewish councils in every city, JCRC, if you want to call it. They had them in every city. And they basically, when they came in, anybody who wouldn't agree to stay on under their auspices of the Nazis would be killed. And eventually people said, well, I'd rather join than be alive. And they became, if you will, little empires. They famous one, Rumkovsky and Mudge and Moshe Marine and such. And they began to be the ones who made up the lists of who would be transported. Now, from their point of view, and again, I judge nobody because I've never been in that position, okay? Of having to decide who has to live and die. I don't want to be in that position. But they felt that if they could hold on, holding on was the most important thing. Hold on. Remember, when you're in the middle of something like a war, this kind of war. You don't know when it's going to end. What if it ends in a year? What if it ends in 3 months? So our job is to keep on, keep on. So people who were frail were perhaps put on the list. The people who had money were able to get off the list. Smuggle stuff and do stuff like that. So then it became, in its own way, corrupted. And ironically, of course, everybody who participated in this eventually died. Ovens as well. No one saved themselves. That's the whole thing. No one saved themselves. Because ultimately you kept feeding the beast, feeding the beast, feeding the beast. It's never satiated until you basically chop off its head. And eventually we were able to chop off its head. It took a long time. So she mentions this, and it got a lot of reaction about the fact that, maybe she was saying that Jews collaborated in their own disaster. Which I think was a misinterpretation. I think she was really pointing to the fact that these very difficult circumstances created very, very gruesome and grueling kinds of situations that we now find very, very hard. It's easy after the fact, but in the middle of it, you don't know what to say. I kept another 150 people alive in a workshop because I was able to get something from the Germans, and then they asked me to put a couple of other names on the list to go out to the Umschlagplatz, to the departure point. What am I right? Am I wrong? What am I doing? Am I saving a life? Am I not saving a life? So she put that into question. That led to a lot of reaction. You can imagine from a lot of people. And more importantly, I think the book was such a tremendous focus that it did wonders for opening up our eyes to the fact that that it would be far easier for us to deal with the Shoah if every Nazi was an alien from outer space with sharp teeth and had drool dripping down and didn't look like you and me. There was another controversial book that came out a number of years ago by Daniel Goldhagen, if you remember, called Hitler's Willing Executioners. And really, people got crazy about it. And he said, look, the system couldn't have worked unless everybody was part of it. So you had Mr. Schultz, a very nice gentleman, Mr. Schultz, who lives in the Mitte, the beautiful section of Berlin. 2 little wonderful kids, beautiful wife. And his job is only to arrange train schedules. That's what he does all day. Guess what? If Mr. Schultz goes home for lunch every day, right? Comes home and puts his baby on his lap and sings songs. But basically, if he hadn't put those stamps on or screwed up that schedule, he could have screwed up that schedule maybe. Maybe 1,000 people would have saved him off. Maybe he would save it for 5 days. I don't know. See, that's why I can't get into that, kind of thing. So this is what I think she was basically trying to say, and this is what Goldhagen was going to say. People were saying, no, that's not the way. They were rabid anti-Semites, and that's all they cared about, there's anti-Semitism, and it was more than that. So, and you have different views. There's a new book came out this week on Lucy Davidovich, her book, The War Against the Jews, a new book. Her thesis was that the whole war was meant only for one purpose, was to kill the Jews. So they would even have them work against their own victory in order to, why did they really have to go to Hungary in March of 1944? To kill 1 million more Jews. The war was not going in their direction at that point. Waste of the trains, as supposedly Himmler said, we need to send the trains to the east away from where you're sending them because you have the Soviets we got to deal with. It's complicated. What I like about what Hannah Arendt does, first of all, she has a tremendous sense of Jewish history, of what it meant to be a modern Jew in Germany from the very beginning, the issues of enlightenment. But one of her books was a very interesting book about a woman named Rachel Verhagen. Anybody ever heard of her? Rachel Verhagen ran a major salon in Berlin for the elite avant-garde that came together. She wrote a book which was called Salonfrau. She ran this, and it was anybody who was anybody. I don't know if Diane's ever heard of her, Rachel Verhagen, but it was a book that she wrote early, and that later got published. But it was always in her mind this image of this woman who was sort of a Jewish woman, and the role of that Jewish woman in trying to basically create this conduit into elite culture. Eventually, she was even going to marry a non-Jew, but eventually it doesn't work for her. Because ultimately, she's always seen as a Jew, no matter what she does. That's the thing. That's why she, she admires her too. It's not like she doesn't admire her. She admires her intellectual breadth. I mean, you got to understand, even Hannah Arendt, you have to admire a woman in the time that she was working to get that kind of education, to get that kind of influence, to get the kind of real relationships with male philosophers and academics. And stuff. This is quite a broad. She's a tough broad. She worked very hard. She knew a great deal. And I think she just astounded people, to be honest, in her erudition, and that's why she was so well known. Anybody else? Yes, Diane, I'm glad you're coming in and correct anything I said wrong, please.
Well, first of all, two things. I see that Barbara Moss has already has her hand up before me in the chat.
Well, she already spoke at the beginning. Okay, go ahead.
So I want to defer to her.
Oh, but Barbara was the first one to speak.
Oh, okay, great.
So, yeah,
and then Jill. I think Jill had her hand up.
Jill, would you like to go in?
I want Diane to go first.
Okay.
Sure. Well, I like your theory about the relationship with Heidegger. It's so complicated. And once students discovered that they had a romantic relationship, this always becomes a focal point of the conversation. But I'm just curious about the other student of Heidegger who had such a different response, certainly was not someone romantically involved, after he came to understand the betrayal of Heidegger, and that's Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas was also a student of Heidegger, and it's so amazing that Arendt went in one path, and of course, Levinas became one of the most profound Jewish philosophers of the 20th century and re-embraced a kind of synthesis of philosophy and traditional Judaism and Talmudic studies in a way as a reaction, he said, of Heidegger's betrayal, that he would either have to kill himself or completely reconstruct philosophy to understand what had happened to his teacher. So it's just so interesting that what happens when students come to terms with that level, as Jews, that level of the profound betrayal of someone who was so influential in their lives. So that
just as a curiosity, it happens in Marburg. The reason I'm saying Marburg, for those who don't know why it's interesting, Marburg was really the seat of Kantianism.
Right.
And one of the great Jewish philosophers that we didn't have a chance to talk about, so many, Hermann Cohen. Hermann Cohen was the one who really gave rebirth to Kantianism. Neo-Kantianism it was called. And it was a very influential place. So even the fact that she was at Marburg
right.
was
and another thing I've never been able
right?
to come to terms with
right.
Heidegger is that he wrote this famous essay on art and aesthetics that's listed in every book on art history while he was rector of Marburg as a Nazi.
As a Nazi, after 33, right.
And that's really not ever discussed. And so it's kind of mind-boggling to me, but anyway, that's...
Well, look, I'm saying...
for another class.
That's for another class on Heidegger. And Heidegger's basic, he was I would put him into the existentialist school a little bit as he got... His major book is possible to read. It's called Being in Time. Right. And it's not an easy around the pool kind of book. Really
but anyway, but I think that you're thinking about Arendt's relationship to him as really, that was crucial. That's really, that's interesting and original. I'd never thought about that. So thank you.
That's
anyway, I'll pass it on to Jill.
Okay, that's my little bit, yeah.
I just wanted to comment on your comment about the reason for the Eichmann trial being a way to tell the story. And I think what was very interesting about it was that it allowed Israel, because after the war, Jews in Palestine they saw the Jews who in Europe as victims. They didn't want to know about the war. They didn't want to allow people to tell their stories. And so this really brought the attention to the Israel. I think it changed the state of Israel in a lot.
It may have changed the Israel, but I'm saying the impetus did not come from the Bronx. The impetus came from Israel.
Yes, it did. But
The impetus was that they had been that the Israelis were following Nazis from the day after, from the day after the war ended. So they were dedicated to this.
No, and I'm just talking about the effect of having the stories told, having the victims come and testify was it had a profound effect on Israel.
I think more internationally, to be honest. I think on Israel, it was impossible to avoid it because every other person either had a number on their arm or etc.
But I don't think that they were...
I mean, it was not like in the United States. In the United States, my mother, when she came, said you could not mention what she had gone through here in the United States. Jews were not eager to hear it. It was a conversation stopper. You know what I mean? In Israel, that was never the case. All I'm saying is that the Eichmann trial brought it to the international. I mean, I lived in New York at the time I was a kid. I was 12 years old, whatever, 12 years old. And it was on, because of New York's large Jewish population in the area, there was a show every night, a half hour, with a review of those days' proceedings at the Eichmann trial, because of the time differences between Israel and the United States. So it was a big eye opener. There's no question about it. But as I say, as much as I agree with you that the Israelis were hesitant, there was no way that any Israeli ever could avoid it because of the fact that there was a population of 600,000 who came in, and the population of Israel wasn't much larger than that. So it was like almost impossible. But you're right. It brought the international attention to it. Yes. Anyone else who hasn't spoken before? Please. Diane, you want to get back in, Barbara? You have a second comment, please. Barbara Moss, you have a second comment?
I'm listening.
Okay. Diane?
Well, a couple of
You
things.
have two Dianes, right?
Oh, that's right. I'm sorry.
Yes, hi, Diane.
No, Diane, right.
Yeah. And that I was going to say that there were different aspects that were affected in Israel because that were similar to the United States. But despite the fact you couldn't avoid something in Israel, there was still such shame in both countries. In the United States, the Jewish community had its own shame towards survivors. And in Israel, it was also the same, the attitude towards Yiddish. I mean, it's a very complicated issue, I think, in terms of what the Eichmann trial finally came to. But the thing that interests me as the next generation of Jews in the United States was that I grew up with parents who, had the Germans were trafe. If you met a German, you silently spat. I mean, there was a world that I was part of that was not considered a good American world. So I would be ashamed of family that saw Germans that way. But I ended up...
It began when they were young in the 30s,
Right.
The anti-boycott stuff, right?
But then comes the Vietnam War in the United States, and Jews were overrepresented in terms of our numbers, in terms of the activists. And we brought the same morality to the issue of Vietnam that my family had towards Germany. How could our country, the United States, we saw, LBJ as evil. There were a lot of similarities in terms of how the hurt and the anger got expressed that I saw in an Americanized way that was very similar to what had happened before. And the Hannah Arendt thing has always moved me because I think she was standing up for something very important, which is systems create this, that people are not necessarily evil. And to say this person is evil and that person is not misses a complexity of human life. Certainly people are responsible ultimately for what they do, but it's systems. And I thought she fought an important battle, and her Israeli friends turned their backs on her for trying to enter into what I thought was a legitimate dialogue about these things.
I think, thank you. That's a good segue to what I wanted to just say now. There was, in her book, The Human Condition, which I recommend, 1958, The Human Condition, which is probably her most influential book because it's a lot easier to read than the arguments. She differentiates between political and social concepts, labor and work, and various forms of actions. And then she explores what are the implications of making these distinctions between labor and work, etc., political and social. So her theory of political action, corresponding to the existence of a public realm, is extensively developed in this book. She argues that while human life always evolves within societies, the social part of human nature, political life, has been intentionally realized in only a few societies where a space is made for individuals to achieve freedom. Okay, that's very important. So we should not take for granted that that we've always had societies which allow that, right? And even our society might not allow that. She goes on and says, conceptual categories which attempt to bridge the gap between the ontological, the thing in and of itself, and sociological structures are sharply delineated. And she says she relegates labor and work to the realm of the social. She favors the human condition of action as that which is both existential and aesthetic. Of human actions, Arendt identifies two that she considers essential. And this is something you might agree with or not, of course. These are these two. These are forgiving past wrong, or if you want to see it, unfixing fixed past, and promising future benefit, or if you will, fixing an unfixed future. And she was introduced to this idea when she did a dissertation was on love and Saint Augustine. That was based on his Confessions, very famous, influential book in Western culture. She develops this further when she departs from Heidegger's emphasis on mortality. Arendt's positive message is one of the miracle of beginning. That's what I want you to come away with this from. I save this for the end here. The miracle of beginning, the continual arrival of the new to create action. That is to alter the state of affairs brought about by previous actions. Men, she wrote, though they must die, are not born in order to die, but in order to begin. She defined her use of this word, I never saw it before when I read it, natality. Natality, right? Neonate, right? Natal, natality. The miracle that saves the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal natural ruin, is ultimately the fact of natality, in which, I'm quoting from her, in which the faculty of action is ontologically rooted. It is, in other words, the birth of new men and the new beginning. The action they are capable of by virtue of being born. And natality would go on to become a central concept of her political theory, which has, in a sense, probably her most optimistic one. So it is why we came to be. We are born in order to be able to begin. That's a wonderful way of seeing what our role is. Not necessarily always to realize we're born, and as I say, so preordained in what's going to happen, but it's not preordained. We are born to begin. So as Rosenzweig ended his book, Into Life, I think what we could say is that Hannah Arendt has told us, begin. Never end, begin. That's a very, for me, is very touching, because she's not an emotional writer at all. She's very, I mean, you're overwhelmed by her knowledge. I mean, that's her erudition. It's like she's read everything. And not only that, but she knows how to quote it. It's just overwhelmingly wonderful. So if you wouldn't want to get a PDF of her Jewish writings, a small collection, obviously. I'll be glad to send that to you. You can't really, copy it legally, but you copy a page or two if you want. It's a few stars. Don't make money on it. I have a lawyer, ex-lawyer, no lawyer here. The judge will say, yeah, am I right? You can't copy the whole thing. And so,
A little bit. Personal.
You can take a chapter on it. But there's a big piece there on anti-Semitism, which you wrote before, which became part of the book that came out in 1951. So you can see the earlier stuff there in that English writings. So anything else? How do we want to wrap it up?
Moshe?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, it strikes me, your description of her view of natality, two things strike me about that. One is that it evokes I think of a very Jewish view of the world, that yesterday is not, does not dictate what tomorrow is going to be, and that you have a responsibility to affect the world in which you're living.
Civil action. No question.
And the other part, was that a reaction to the existential movement that was common, that was,
I mean, she was certainly influenced by the movement away from thought to action. If you remember, we talked about last time, one of the real moves of existentialism was not Descartes' I think, therefore I am. It was the opposite, remember? It was I am, therefore I think. I am, that's there, therefore I am. So it's the existential individual, ultimately, from which things evolve, and the other way around. So in that sense, yes, I would say she basically says, thinking about it is not enough. She moves from thought to action.
But that's sort of contrary to the emphasis I heard you describing about systems and how people are, to some extent, victims of the system.
Yes, but I agree. But she says, look, it's like anything else. If there was more action earlier on, things would have changed. It's not preordained. It is the inability of civil action. So what makes totalitarianism so dangerous is that it tries to eliminate the actors. Right? Whoever can be seen as an actor, however you see it, culturally, financially, whatever, you get rid of them. You get rid of them as soon as possible. They're the first to go. Right? The first people to go to concentration camps were not Jews. They were political opponents, labor, union people, communists, whatever. Anybody who could stand in the way of having a opposing kind of ideology was used. I mean, we're certainly became a major issue, of course. But ultimately, the first 5 years of the regime, from 1933 to 38, I think that's why Kristallnacht is the beginning of the anti-Jewish, events. 5 years, it was getting rid of everybody else who could act, and that's the issue. And we avoid being in a place, and I think we can, to be in a place where people who are willing to stand up are not erased. That's what they did. They erased you. It's like you weren't there anymore. Michael.
So is there a connection, say, between the concept of action and the position of the pariah? What I mean by that is that the pariah is the person who is true to him or herself, rather than trying to conform to the greater society. So the pariah is, in a sense, the protection against totalitarianism.
That's right.
The pariah is acting authentic. Yep. And the problem of totalitarianism, among its many problems, is that it tries to extinguish the pariah and therefore eliminate the actor and the ability of people to be authentic.
Right. And to make that pariah, what they were very successful at, particularly in Nazism, is you identify that pariah as a certain group. Understand? So the pariah it becomes a certain group. And that's why ultimately the parvenu and the pariah wind up in the same concentration camp. Because ultimately there's a need to identify what the pariah is in order to deal with that. But they use harsher terms than pariah He used virus. Bacilli, that's the term, right, that we used, right? These bacilli had to be extinguished in order to save ourselves, so it became sort of, a tremendous system based upon the fact that what we were doing was the best possible thing to do. You got to think people would thought that. I know it's how is that possible, you would say. How is it possible? You know what? I don't want to get us off the hook so fast. I don't know. I ask myself this question a lot. If a police car came to my next door neighbor's house in the middle of the night and took my neighbor out, would I stop and ask the cop, what did he do? Would you? Would you? So my upstairs neighbor in Berlin, Mr. Schwartz, a nice couple. Oh, he must have done something wrong. The police came for him. You know how insidious this is? This is insidious, right? Because when you make these kinds of totalitarianism, this is legal. This is what is. This is what is. It's not a desire of what will be. This is what is. So we have to ask ourselves those questions. Thank God, I feel confident in this country, particularly, that there are enough people who are willing to stand up to things that it won't come to that. And what's happened over the last 6 weeks give me some sense of the fact that people are willing to stand up.
But RebMoshe.
Yes, Lily, and then we'll get to Jill.
What I was going to say though is maybe you wouldn't question that neighbor upstairs, but maybe you'd question the guy next door. In other words, the second time it happened. In other words, maybe you'd be shocked the first time, but maybe you shouldn't be shocked the second, third, or fourth, the fifth time. But by then you are scared. That's the thing. That's how they get you.
Right, because if it's arbitrary, maybe this is arbitrary. Next week it's going to be me. On the other hand, for me, that should be an impetus. That exactly is what's counterintuitive. If I'm really scared it's going to be possibly, I should definitely, early as possible, find out why this person is being arrested. And they'll give you some reason. I mean, it wasn't because he's a Jew. He's a smuggler, he's a swindler, he did this. There'll be all kinds of excuses, even though you know that person is not. But that doesn't matter what you know. I mean, the truth does not matter. Remember that. The truth is not part of this equation. Yes, Jill.
When Adam Teller had his course on the Holocaust, he talked about the fact that many people were just doing their job, their regular jobs. So, for example, the train scheduler.
The train scheduler, right.
Was scheduling trains. And then the policeman in Amsterdam was enforcing the law. The law may have been a corrupt law, but he was doing what he was supposed to be doing. And that's the machine I think she might have been talking about, is that if you corrupt the law, but you have these people in place that are doing their jobs, it...
Absolutely. I mean, we have now, in the last 3 years, more Trump-appointed judges, am I right, Ken, than in a long, long time. Am I correct? That some of these judges have offices they can't be voted out of. Am I correct? Some of them are appointed.
Almost universally, they can't be, if they're appointed federal judges, they can't be removed with
can't be removed. So we've already seen in the last 3 years, maybe longer, already a way the courts could be very strongly manipulated by having appointees that are clearly partisan appointees. Now, that, thank God, we still have some enclaves of sanity. Some of them, we even found one in the Supreme Court recently. It's hard to believe that it was an enclave of sanity, but it was. And at a certain point, the court knows that there is a power in the force in right now that would like to usurp them. There's no question. They know it. They know it. And it's happening in Israel with Netanyahu, right? Anybody following this? He's trying to undermine the court. The fellow in Poland who won yesterday, unfortunately, the Duda, right? He won yesterday, unfortunately. Very close race. First thing he did when he came in was dismantle the courts, or at least dismantle. Make sure his people were in the courts. Yeah, I agree. I think he's right that once you have once you have a system that, what I think Goldhagen was saying and others, is you got to understand, the system could be upset along the way. I mean, it was not predetermined that the system would work. There had to be a lot of things coming together in order to make it work. So with Mr. Schultz, nice Mr. Schultz, who goes home for lunch every day, is he aware enough? Does he care enough? Has he ever really cared about this or not? But does he see the writing on the wall and he sees what he's doing? And this is, remember, 1936, there were already racial laws. He's not totally in the dark. This is before there were concentration camps. I mean, anti-Semitism was quite blatant. He didn't have to guess what was going on when he had to schedule all these trains to Poland in this one place. Yes, Michael, and then we'll have to wrap it up soon. Michael.
Yes, the problem, though, is that in almost every person's life, you make a series of kind of ethical compromises, whether it be in your work or in your community, and you're part of a system that often accomplishes a lot of negative things or overlooks a lot of negative things every day. If you're, part of the business world, the way capital is structured, the way, all this stuff, right? I mean, so it's really, to me, it's really hard to know the point at which you're sliding a little bit too far. And that's, I assume that's part of her thesis as well, that it's just so, it's just, if you actually looked at every one of the ethical compromises you make every day by simply being part of the world in which we live or going on Facebook or whatever it happens to be, it's kind of hard to not see yourself as kind of sliding into the wrong place. And I think
it's a challenge.
By the time you get too far, sometimes it's hard to get back.
Well, that's one of the reasons I think that these books, people, etc., are important for us, not only as philosophers and political scientists, but as Jews. I think that Rosenzweig and Arendt will talk about other Jews next week, Eugene Borowitz, Arthur Cohen. But the thinking is, what does a Jew still have to say in the world? That's the question. So I asked once, there's a fellow in our neighborhood, Joshua Rubenstein. He used to work for ACLU for many years. And if you know, anybody know him, Josh? So Josh writes about Russian history, etc. Now he's a fundraiser for Harvard Medical Law School. And he wrote a number of books, one on Ilya Ehrenberg. His name's strike a bell of any of you at all. Ilya Ehrenberg was a Jew who was a major spokesman for the communists in the 30s and 40s, a journalist, et cetera, et cetera. And he was once asked about, tell me, Ilya, you're a Jew, they don't like you very much as a Jew, So he said, why is it they don't like Jews? And he says, because Jews have a problem. They keep saying no. No, shouldn't be this way. That's a real pain in the ass. No, you have a choice.
Pariahs. We're pariahs.
Pariahs, exactly. So I call that chutzpah. I call it that's part of what we are meant to do, is to have chutzpah. We have to have chutzpah. And chutzpah means you will get people pissed at you. Yes, that's chutzpah. But the bottom line is, I'm proud to say that as of now, I think we're becoming a much more cohesive community and facing some of the challenges which are more gigantic than any one of us ever can imagine is going to be part of the next 10 years of our lives. I mean, you can't even stretch your mind to realize of what is going to happen in the next 10 years. Except one thing, I want us as a Jewish community to have that voice that says, no. They don't like this. I didn't like it when people did this to me, but you know what? Sometimes somebody's got to do that to you. No. the Dutch, Marilyn, and then we'll wrap it up.
This is completely off topic.
Okay?
Because it's been in the news and because it's sort of in my consciousness, what went on at the New York Times regarding Barry Weiss
Yes.
and all the tentacles there, that come out of that. It's a very obviously Jewish topic.
I read it today, not as carefully as I wanted to. I read the whole letter today in the Atlantic.
Can you tell us what it is?
Yes, Barry Weiss was a columnist reporter for the New York Times, and she resigned today. And she wrote a...
She's also on the board of
the editorial board.
Ed page of
The editorial board, right.
Right.
She resigned with a number of claims, which from her vantage point, I understand, that she was seen as quote unquote too Jewish, maybe a little to the right of what
a little bit too militantly for Israel.
Too militantly for Israel. So she claimed that all of these forces were getting more and more surfaced over the last number of years, and she felt that she no longer had a home at the New York Times. That's what she said, basically. She no longer had a home there. So again,
I wasn't just talking about that. I was talking about, and then the tentacles that go out from there regarding the not just far right, but the far left, and what the Jewish kind of role is in all
this is right. This is why it's very complicated. There's no question.
And in the Black Lives Matter movement, and all of this, how Jews are very central to this entire dynamic.
Well, I don't want to give away my Shabbat Kabbalah.
Okay, but
it might be this week. You'll read something about it, but I don't want to get into that right now. But so this is Barry Weiss. If you're interested, I think the Atlantic published her resignation.
I just
food for thought.
For a conversation after.
It's a good conversation. It's a good conversation.
For
so I think that's it for tonight. So I hope I gave you a little taste. See, my job is to give you a trop, a little drop, and then you'll say, "Oh, this Hannah Arendt, I want to know more about her." You have no problem finding out more about her because there's so much about her. And as I say, it's if you have never read the book, it's a tough book to read, and I don't recommend going for it and trying to read the whole thing through. It's not Moby Dick, and even Moby Dick I never got through. So that's but just know about this person who is really attuned, right, to all of these issues in a very serious and I think judicial way. And the fact that so much of it is coming up today again shows her prescience, but it also shows how stupid we have been in not really allowing the veil to, cover our eyes again. This is really it's a disappointment.
Who are you talking about next week?
Next week, we're talking about a gentleman who was very influential in the creation of the New Reform, the Reform movement, named Eugene Borowitz. Each section will be on its own. Eugene Borowitz taught for many years at HUC, wrote a number of very influential books, was a nice man, and he was a teacher of many of my colleagues. And then my last one is going to be a fellow who you probably not have heard of at all, Borowitz you may have heard of, because he started the Shema newsletter years and years, about 40 years ago. And then there's my last class will be on Arthur A. Cohen, theologian, writer, literateur, very interesting fellow, and hopefully I'll put some material about it as well. Arthur A. Cohen, you have to have it. If your name is Arthur Cohen, you better have a middle and an initial, otherwise.
You should just call him Moshe AAC.
AAC, right. Very good, very good. So thank you all for joining us. I know it was not an easy topic, but I'm glad that we have a recording of it. Somebody actually told me that they actually look at this when they have a chance. So I say that's good.
Thank you, Reb.
Thank you.
Well, love to you all.
Thanks, Moshe.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.